one cracked toffee apple, two hidden hands, and murder in plain sight. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Let me know where you're listening from. Your comments bring us together. Now, the orchard's secret unfolds. The sun lay warm upon the orchards of Sayont, Mildred's, painting the ripening apples in shades of gold and crimson. It was the first Saturday of September, and the annual harvest fair had brought nearly the entire village into the vicarage gardens. Bunting flapped in the gentle breeze, tables sagged under jars of chutney and jam, and the air smelled of baking bread and new-mown grass. Children darted between stalls, clutching toffee apples, while the older folk clustered in conversational knots, exchanging news and sly observations about who had brought what to the baking competition. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the edge of the tea tent, was engaged in the delicate business of selecting a seed cake slice when she happened to notice, without seeming to notice, the Reverend Pottle's wife stiffen in mid-sentence. The vicar's wife had been speaking to Mrs. Caroline Price, tall, elegant, and rather too well dressed for a village gathering, when a sudden flush crept up her neck. Mrs. Price, for her part, offered a smile as brittle as frost on autumn grass before turning to greet someone else. Miss Marple's pale eyes followed the exchange with quiet interest. Just then, the chatter was pierced by a sharp, startled cry from the far side of the orchard. Heads turned, a few people began to run, skirts and hats bobbing among the trees. Miss Marple set down her cake, adjusted her hat, and rose without hurry. It was the turn of the apple press, a traditional centerpiece of the fair, where two sturdy lads had been demonstrating the old wooden press to admiring onlookers. Now the crowd there was hushed, drawing back like ripples in water. At the base of the press, partly hidden by a spill of windfall apples, lay the body of a man. His jacket was of fine cut but rumpled, his face strangely still, and one hand was curled as though clutching at the grass. A toffee apple, its bright red coating cracked, rested a little distance away. Mrs. Pottle, pale as milk, was holding a handkerchief to her lips. It took only moments for whispers to coil through the orchard. "It's Harold Price, Caroline's husband, don't you know? Dropped like a stone, they say. Heart, perhaps. Well, if you ask me." And then, inevitably, the murmurs of something darker. Miss Marple listened, her expression that of an elderly lady, mildly perplexed by all the fuss. She had known Harold Price only in passing, a man of genial manners, but with a faint air of calculation about the eyes. It was, of course, entirely possible that he had suffered a seizure in the warmth of the day. And yet, Miss Marple reflected, things seldom happened without a reason, and in villages, reasons had a way of being entangled in old grudges and quiet resentments. The constable arrived in a brisk clatter of bicycle tires, looking rather overwhelmed by the gathering of villagers, all eager to offer their recollections and theories. Caroline Price, composed but pale, stood apart from the throng, her gaze fixed on the body. Miss Marple noted, just as she noted the peculiar way Caroline's gloved hand lingered at her side, fingers trembling almost imperceptibly. Somewhere above, an apple detached from its bough and thudded softly onto the grass, unnoticed. The fair continued around them in muted tones, but Miss Marple knew, with the certainty of one long accustomed to the undercurrents of human behavior, that the peace of St. Mildred's had just been broken, and that before it was restored, certain truths long hidden would rise like bruised fruit to the surface. The orchard was still, save for the low drone of bees and the occasional rustle of leaves overhead. The constable knelt awkwardly beside the body, his pencil poised over a small notebook. Though it was plain to Miss Marple he was at a loss as to what, precisely, he should be writing. He cleared his throat several times and looked up at the little knot of villagers pressing closer. "Now then," he said with as much authority as he could muster, "I'll need you all to stand back. Can't have the scene disturbed." His eyes flicked to Mrs. Price. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll have to ask you some questions presently." Mrs. Price inclined her head, though the movement seemed mechanical. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady. "I understand, Constable, though I assure you I've no idea what could have happened. My husband was in perfectly good health this morning." "That so, ma'am?" "Well, we'll see." Miss Marple, standing a few paces away, found her attention drawn less to Mrs. Price's words than to the way she avoided looking directly at her husband's still form. Instead, Caroline's gaze hovered somewhere beyond, fixed on the apple trees, where a scattering of golden fruit glimmered in the sun. Miss Marple had seen that look before. On those who wished above all else to be somewhere, anywhere, other than the place in which they found themselves. Gradually the crowd began to disperse under the constable's mild urging, some returning to the tea tent in subdued murmurs, others drifting toward the village green to speculate in more comfortable surroundings. The vicar, his face pale, came forward to offer assistance, though it was clear his chief aim was to restore a sense of order before the fair collapsed entirely. The two young men who had been demonstrating the apple press stood off to one side, their faces tight with unease. Miss Marple approached them quietly. "A terrible shock for you both," she said gently. "You must have been quite close when it happened." The taller of the two, a broad-shouldered fellow named Alfie Marks, nodded. "He came over not long after we started, asked a few questions about the press, seemed right interested. Then he stepped back to watch. Next thing, down he went. Just like that." "And did he speak to anyone else?" Alfie frowned. "Can't say I noticed. Maybe a word to Mrs. Hartwell. She was buying cider from the next table. But he weren't carrying on with anyone, not as I saw." The other lad, Tom Pritchard, shifted uneasily. "He was eating something, though. Bit into a toffee apple just before he fell. Dropped it when well, he trailed off." Miss Marple's eyes went to the bright, broken sweet lying a few feet away. She did not stoop to examine it. There would be time for that later. But the image fixed itself in her mind. A toffee apple was an unlikely instrument of death, but then she had learned long ago that unlikely did not mean impossible. By now, word had traveled swiftly to the village, and Dr. Greenaway, summoned from his surgery, arrived puffing slightly from his brisk walk. He knelt beside the body, peering over his spectacles. After a brief examination, he straightened, his expression grave. "Constable," he said, "this is no case of heart failure. I'll not say more until the coroner's seen him, but I have my suspicions." The constable's Adam's apple bobbed. "Suspension? Oh, I see." He glanced about nervously, lowering his voice. "Best not to go putting notions in people's heads, eh, Doctor?" But notions, Miss Marple knew, needed no encouragement. They were already in full bloom among the villagers. She overheard Mrs. Hartwell telling Mrs. Sims in an urgent whisper that Harold Price had been seen arguing with Mr. Elcott from the dairy only last week, and that there had been some unpleasantness over a property matter. Meanwhile, Mrs. Briggs from the post office confided to anyone who would listen that Caroline Price had been spending an awful lot of time with a gentleman from the golf club whenever her husband was away. Miss Marple, appearing to concern herself with smoothing the edge of her glove, absorbed each tidbit without seeming to do so. She had no need to chase gossip. It traveled to her as naturally as pollen to a flower. The removal of the body was carried out discreetly, the constable and 2 stout volunteers lifting Harold Price onto a stretcher and bearing him toward the lane, where the doctor's motor car waited. Mrs. Price followed at a small distance, her chin high, but her complexion chalk white. As the orchard began to empty, Miss Marple wandered toward the cider table, ostensibly to purchase a small bottle for her housekeeper, though in truth her mind was already turning over certain details. Harold Price had been speaking to the lads at the apple press, had eaten a toffee apple, and then collapsed almost immediately. If there had been poison, it would have acted with unusual swiftness, or he had already been unwell before he bit into the sweet. But Dr. Greenaway's tone suggested otherwise. She noticed, too, that the toffee apples on display now were fewer than before, and the remaining ones had been hastily gathered under a cloth. The stall's keeper, a plump woman named Mrs. Felton, was dabbing at her forehead with a kerchief. "Such a dreadful thing, Miss Marple," Mrs. Felton said, her voice trembling. "I never thought... I've been making these for years. Never had a soul take ill from them." "I'm sure you haven't," Miss Marple replied kindly. "Did you make them all yourself?" "Oh yes, this morning. Sugar boiled up with vinegar and a drop of red coloring, just like always. Only difference this year was, I had young Maggie help me wrap them. She's a good girl, though. Wouldn't hurt a fly." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course. And did Mr. Price choose his apple himself?" Mrs. Felton frowned. "No, I handed it to him. He gave me the coin. I passed it over. He was chatting with Mrs. Hartwell at the time. I remember because she joked he'd ruin his teeth before the raffle." Such small remarks often lodged in Miss Marple's mind like burrs on wool. The detail of who handed over the apple might prove nothing, or everything. By late afternoon, the fair had dwindled to a shadow of its former bustle. The bunting hung limp, the laughter had vanished, and people moved in small, tense clusters, speaking in low voices. The vicar, seeing Miss Marple near the tea tent, approached with an air of concern. "My dear Miss Marple, I do hope you're not too shaken by all this unpleasantness. A most dreadful business. The Prices haven't been here long, you know. Took the old mill house only last year. One always hopes newcomers will settle in quietly, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "One always hopes." She looked toward the lane where the doctor's car had gone, the dust still faint in the air. And yet, people bring more than their trunks and furniture when they move to a place. Old ties, old habits, even old enmities. The vicar gave her a puzzled glance, but Miss Marple merely smiled, as though she had said nothing of consequence. Evening settled over St. Mildred's, with a cool mist that blurred the hedgerows and dimmed the lights in the cottage windows. Miss Marple sat by her parlor fire, knitting in her lap, her thoughts as neat and ordered as the rows of stitches. She had no proof, no more than the faintest outline of an idea. But she could not shake the sense that Harold Price's death was no sudden accident. The orchard had been full of eyes, yet perhaps none had truly seen what mattered. She thought again of Caroline Price, composed, pale, avoiding her husband's body, of the toffee apple, broken on the grass, of the cider table, the apple press, the laughter cut short, and of Mrs. Felton's casual mention of Maggie helping wrap the sweets. In Miss Marple's experience, the simplest details were often the most dangerous when overlooked. Somewhere in the village, someone knew precisely what had happened beneath those apple boughs. And Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and unhurried questions, intended to find out, one careful stitch at a time. The following morning broke with a pale, watery sunlight that did little to dispel the lingering unease in St. Mildred's. The church bells rang as usual for Sunday service, but their mellow tones seemed oddly subdued, as though they too felt the weight of yesterday's events. Miss Marple, neat in her dove-gray coat and sensible hat, made her way up the lane to St. Mildred's Church at her customary unhurried pace. She knew the service would be as much about quiet observation as worship that morning. Villagers tended to reveal more in the pews and in the churchyard afterwards than they ever would under the direct gaze of a constable. Inside, the congregation was smaller than usual, though the Price household was conspicuously present. Caroline Price sat toward the front, her black gloves folded precisely in her lap, a thin veil shielding her expression. She had chosen a darker ensemble than the weather called for. Perhaps, Miss Marple thought, to lend an air of bereavement before it had been officially sanctioned. Grief could be genuine, but its presentation was often tailored to its audience. As the vicar's sermon meandered through the parable of the wheat and the tares, Miss Marple's attention drifted to the pew behind Mrs. Price, where Mrs. Hartwell sat, upright and still, her lips pressed into a fine line. That, in itself, was unusual. Mrs. Hartwell was normally a fidgeter, inclined to rustle her hymn book or adjust her hat pin. Today she seemed determined to keep her gaze fixed on the back of Caroline Price's veil. After the final hymn, the villagers spilled into the churchyard, forming the familiar post-service clusters. Here, gossip moved in careful currents, cloaked in solicitous tones and murmurs about what a dreadful shock it must have been. Miss Marple stood near the yew tree, exchanging a polite word or two, but listening intently. The constable was there, looking distinctly uncomfortable in his Sunday best as he spoke to Dr. Greenaway. The doctor, for his part, maintained a professional gravity, but Miss Marple noted the slight shake of his head, the low murmur that caused the constable's brows to knit. She could imagine the conversation, the necessity of a post-mortem, the certainty that Harold Price's death had not been natural. Mrs. Hartwell drifted close, as if by accident. "Poor Mrs. Price," she murmured to Miss Marple, her voice pitched for sympathy, yet sharpened with an undercurrent of relish. "They say Harold was a difficult man. Oh, polite enough in company, but one never knows, does one?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly. "One never knows." Mrs. Hartwell leaned a little closer. "You didn't hear this from me, but there was that business with Mr. Elcott, about the old dairy plot. And, well, perhaps it's not the time to speak of it. Still, these things have a way of coming out." Miss Marple gave a small, encouraging nod, but Mrs. Hartwell was called away before she could elaborate. That was often the way with gossip. It arrived in fragments, each piece needing careful placement before the picture could be seen. On her walk home, Miss Marple took a slight detour, passing the lane that led to the mill house. The gate stood closed, its paint weathered, and a neat row of chrysanthemums lined the path. She did not linger, merely noting that the curtains in the front parlor were drawn halfway, and that a shadow passed briefly across them. Whether it belonged to Caroline Price or another, she could not say. Her next stop was the post office, not ostensibly for any reason connected to the matter at hand. Miss Marple was far too experienced to make her inquiries obvious, but to purchase a sheet of stamps and to exchange a few words with Mrs. Briggs, the postmistress. Mrs. Briggs, bustling behind the counter, was eager to speak of the fair. "Such a tragedy, Miss Marple, and right in the middle of the day, too. You'd think these things happened in dark alleys, not among cider barrels and seed cake." "Life is full of surprises," Miss Marple said, counting out her coins. "I hear Mr. Price had only been in the village a short while." "That's right. Last summer they came, Took the mill house when no one else would have it. Too big, too drafty, and some say it's damp. But he liked to entertain, had folks from the golf club down now and then. Caroline kept herself to herself, mind you. But Harold, well, he was a man who liked to know everyone's business, particularly if there was profit in it. Profit? Mrs. Briggs leaned forward slightly. Property, Miss Marple. He was sniffing around the dairy plot, as you'll have heard, and there was talk of him wanting the orchard next to the vicarage. Not for apples, mind you, something else. No one quite knew what. But there were meetings, and a few crosswords, so they say. Miss Marple thanked her and departed, tucking that morsel away alongside Mrs. Hartwell's earlier remark. Property disputes, she knew, had started more quarrels and more crimes than romance ever had. Back at her cottage, she found her housekeeper, Cherry, bustling about with the teapot. "I've put the wireless on, Miss Marple," Cherry said. "Nothing about Mr. Price, though. Guess it's too soon." "That will come," Miss Marple replied, pouring herself a cup. "Such matters take their own pace." Cherry, who prided herself on being well-informed, leaned on the table. "You know what I think? It was that toffee apple. I saw it myself, bright red and sticky. If there was something in it, it could explain why it happened so quick." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. Perhaps. Though if one wished to harm a man, one would need to be certain he would choose, or be given, that particular apple. Accidents in such arrangements are more common than one might think. Cherry nodded, though she clearly preferred the simplicity of her own theory. Miss Marple did not disabuse her. She preferred to let theories settle naturally. The truth had a way of rising to the surface, if given space. That afternoon, she took a slow walk toward the orchard, ostensibly to admire the late apples. The fair stalls had been dismantled, leaving only trampled grass and a few stray paper cups. She found Mrs. Felton there, gathering the last of her things into a basket. "Such a horrid business," Mrs. Felton sighed. "I barely slept a wink. Kept thinking, what if it was one of mine that did it? I've half a mind never to make toffee apples again." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "My dear, I'm sure no one blames you. Though I am curious. Did anyone handle the apples besides you and your helper?" Mrs. Felton hesitated. "Well, no, not that I saw. Maggie wrapped them like I said. She's young, but she's careful. And Harold didn't even buy it himself. Caroline paid, said she wanted to treat him. He laughed, said it was like being a boy again." Miss Marple felt the smallest tightening in her chest at that detail. "And you handed it straight to him?" "Oh no, Caroline did. I passed it to her, and she turned to him with it. He bit right in. They spoke of other things, recipes, the weather. But Miss Marple walked home with her mind quietly alight. The path of the toffee apple from stall to victim was suddenly very clear, and it began with Caroline Price's gloved hand. By evening, the constable had called at her cottage, ostensibly to see if she had observed anything useful. Miss Marple listened to his questions, answered with the precision of someone who remembered only what she chose to, and let him speak more than she did. From him, she gleaned that the coroner's examination would be the following day, and that Dr. Greenaway suspected a fast-acting poison. Possibly something slipped into the toffee coating. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her knitting needles clicking softly. The pieces were small and scattered still, but she could sense their edges beginning to align. Caroline Price's manner, the orchard's whispered quarrels, the property disputes, the deliberate passing of the toffee apple. Each detail seemed to hum with quiet significance. And yet, She reminded herself, suspicion was not proof. People were rarely exactly what they seemed, and a murder, if murder it was, could be arranged to point in precisely the wrong direction. Someone in St. Mildred's had chosen the time and place of Harold Price's death with care. The challenge, as always, would be to see past the performance to the truth concealed beneath. Somewhere beyond her window, an apple fell with a muffled thump onto the damp grass, the sound startling in the quiet. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. In time, she thought, all fruit falls. So too, in her experience, did secrets. The following day dawned damp and gray, the kind of morning when the mist clung stubbornly to the hedgerows and the cobbles gleamed with moisture. In such weather, St. Mildred's seemed to shrink into itself, its narrow lanes hushed, its curtains drawn later than usual. Miss Marple, however, was up early. She had finished her breakfast and tidied away her tray by 8:30, and was seated by the window with her knitting, when the postman's tread came up the path. Among the usual envelopes was one printed with the coroner's seal, addressed, of course, not to her, but to Dr. Greenaway. Still, it was enough to remind her that this morning would bring certain answers, or at least the official sort of answers. Miss Marple had learned over the years that the coroner's conclusions often addressed the how, but rarely the why. And it was the latter that truly mattered. By 10 o'clock, she was on her way to the small, oak-paneled room adjoining the village hall, where the inquest was to be held. She did not consider herself intrusive. Indeed, she would have been the first to deny it. But in a village, the inquest was as much a public affair as the harvest fair or the Christmas bazaar, and her presence would pass without comment. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued. A few rows of chairs had been set out, occupied by the curious and the concerned in roughly equal measure. Caroline Price sat alone near the front, dressed in deep gray, her veil lowered, her posture the very model of a composed widow. Miss Marple noted how she kept her gloved hands folded on her lap, neither wringing them nor fidgeting, a studied stillness that in itself drew the eye. The coroner, a brisk man with thinning hair and a voice that carried well, opened proceedings with a statement of the facts. Harold Price, aged 45, had collapsed and died during the harvest fair, death occurring within minutes of his symptoms appearing. Dr. Greenaway was called first, giving his evidence with the professionalism expected of him. In my opinion, the doctor said gravely, Mr. Price died from the effects of a toxic substance, most likely cyanide, ingested orally. The symptoms, sudden collapse, rapid cessation of breathing, are consistent with this. The most probable vehicle for the poison was the toffee apple he was seen to be eating immediately before his collapse. A ripple of whispers moved through the room. The coroner's gaze swept the audience, and the murmurs subsided. Can you say whether the poison could have been introduced after the apple was made? Yes, Dr. Greenaway replied. It could have been applied to the surface, perhaps in liquid form, and would have penetrated the sugar coating in places where it had cracked. Mrs. Felton was called next, pale and nervous. But her account matched what Miss Marple had already heard. The apples had been made that morning, Maggie had helped wrap them, and she herself had handed one to Mrs. Price, who then passed it to her husband. Caroline, when called, gave her evidence in a voice steady and low. I had no reason to suspect anything amiss, she said. I simply thought Harold would enjoy a treat. I bought it for him and handed it over, nothing more. The coroner thanked her, and after a brief summation, returned a verdict of death by poisoning, administered by person or persons unknown. That, as far as the law was concerned, was the end of it, for now. But Miss Marple knew that in truth, the matter was only just beginning. As the small crowd filed out, she lingered near the doorway, her pale eyes watchful. Mrs. Hartwell emerged, leaning in to speak to a neighbor, her tone pitched just low enough to force the other woman to lean close. The constable, clearly ill at ease, stood talking to the coroner, his notebook once again clutched like a talisman. Caroline Price, having answered her questions with unruffled composure, walked out alone. Her veil stirred faintly in the misty air as she turned up the lane toward the mill house. Miss Marple, without haste, followed at a distance. She had no wish to confront Mrs. Price, at least not yet. But she was curious to see if the woman's manner changed once she thought herself unwatched. It did not. Caroline's gait was steady, her head held high, her gloved hands at her sides. She might have been returning from a particularly dull social call, rather than from hearing her husband's death declared a deliberate act of murder. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected caller, Maggie herself, the Feltons' young helper. The girl was round-cheeked and freckled, with an air of nervous earnestness. "I hope you don't mind me coming, Miss Marple," she began, twisting her hands together. "It's just, well, Mum says I should speak up if something's bothering me." Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "Quite right, my dear. And what is it that's bothering you?" Maggie hesitated. "It's about those apples. I helped Mrs. Felton wrap them, like I told everyone. But there was one, just one, that had a little crack in the coating. I thought it didn't look as nice, so I put it to one side, back of the tray. Later, when we were setting up, I saw Mrs. Price looking at the apples, and when she bought one, I'm almost sure it was the cracked one." Miss Marple's expression remained mild, but inwardly her mind quickened. "And you didn't mention this before?" "I didn't think it mattered, until the doctor said the poison could get in through a crack." "Very sensible of you to come now," Miss Marple said, and sent the girl off with a reassuring word and a promise to speak to the constable. She would do so, of course, but in her own time and in her own way. The next step, she decided, was to speak to Mr. Elcott. The dairy plot quarrel had been mentioned more than once, and such disputes could fester. She found him that evening tending to his front garden, a burly man with a florid face and a habit of speaking as if every word were an exertion. "Price?" he said when she inquired. "Didn't like him. Too smooth by half, always looking to turn a profit. Wanted my dairy plot for some fancy development. Thought I'd sell because times are hard. But I told him I wasn't born yesterday. We had words, yes. But I'd not go putting poison in his apple, if that's what you're thinking." "Of course not," Miss Marple murmured. "But did you notice anything unusual at the fair?" Elcott shook his head. "Only that Mrs. Price kept herself close to him all day, like she didn't want him talking too freely." It was one more scrap of fabric in the pattern she was piecing together. By the time she returned home, the light was fading, and the mist had thickened into a fine drizzle that blurred the edges of the street lamps. She lit her fire and sat quietly, letting the heat soak into her hands. The facts were simple enough. A toffee apple, a crack in the sugar, a poison that acted swiftly. The apple had passed from Mrs. Felton to Caroline Price, and from Caroline to her husband. The only question, though in truth it was several questions in one, was whether Caroline had known what was on that apple when she handed it over. If she had, then she was the murderer. If she had not, then someone else had contrived to make her the unwitting instrument. Both possibilities were equally dangerous to the person who had done the deed. And Miss Marple, in her gentle, almost invisible way, intended to find out which it was. Somewhere beyond the rain-speckled glass, the branches of the apple trees shifted in the damp breeze, and the memory of that bright, broken sweet lying on the grass returned to her. It was such a small thing, a crack in a sugar shell, and yet it had opened the way to death. The morning after the inquest, St. Mildred seemed to wear its curiosity like a second skin. At the grocer's, customers lingered longer than necessary, over bags of flour and tins of treacle, their conversations slipping inevitably toward the subject of Harold Price. At the bus stop, even the most reserved pensioners exchanged muttered theories about poison, motives, and opportunity. Miss Marple, carrying a modest basket of bread, tea, and 2 apples, bought without comment from Mrs. Felton, passed through these quiet eddies of speculation as though merely absorbed in her shopping list. She neither confirmed nor denied anything, but she noticed. People spoke more freely when they believed she was only half listening, and she was careful to maintain the appearance. Outside the post office, she encountered Dr. Greenaway, who greeted her with a brisk nod. "Ah, Miss Marple. Just the person. I've been meaning to tell you. The coroner's report will likely prompt further police involvement from the county. A suspicious death by poisoning. It's bound to." Miss Marple inclined her head. Quite proper, of course. Though, if I may say so, I doubt an outsider will grasp the finer points as readily as those who live among us. The doctor gave a wry smile. Perhaps not. But they'll expect something tangible. Fingerprints, confessions, the like. Your, methods tend to rely more on the human element. I have always found, Miss Marple replied mildly, that human nature is remarkably consistent, even if circumstances change. After they parted, she decided to pay a call at the mill house. There was a chance Caroline Price might be at home, and Miss Marple was keen to observe her in her own surroundings. The gate squeaked faintly as she pushed it open, and her shoes clicked on the damp stone path. The chrysanthemums lining the walkway looked freshly tended. Caroline herself answered the door. Her attire was impeccable as ever. Charcoal skirt, pale silk blouse, a string of pearls that gleamed softly in the morning light. Her eyes, however, were guarded. "Miss Marple," she said, her tone polite but cool. "Do come in if you've business with me." Miss Marple stepped into a sitting room that smelled faintly of lavender and furniture polish. The furnishings were elegant, but not overly personal. There were no photographs, no small clutter of keepsakes. "I came," Miss Marple began, "to offer my condolences properly. We have not been close neighbors, but in a village such as ours, one feels the loss nonetheless." Caroline inclined her head, her hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. "You're kind. It has been difficult. Harold was not without his faults, but he was my husband." There was an odd flatness in her voice, neither grief-stricken nor defensive. Miss Marple let a small silence bloom before continuing. "It must be some comfort to know the constable is pursuing the matter vigorously." Caroline's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "I suppose, though I confess I am weary of answering the same questions over and over. What I bought at the fair, whom I spoke to, whether Harold had enemies. It seems everyone assumes the answer lies in some petty village quarrel. And you think otherwise?" "I think—" Caroline paused, choosing her words carefully. Harold's affairs extended beyond St. Mildred's. He was not a man content to sit idle. If there was a reason for his death, it may not be found here at all. It was not an unreasonable suggestion, but Miss Marple noted that Caroline did not meet her gaze as she said it. Instead, her eyes lingered on the mantelpiece, where a single silver-framed mirror reflected the room. They spoke a little longer, mostly about village matters. When Miss Marple rose to take her leave, Caroline escorted her to the door with impeccable manners. Yet, as the latch clicked shut behind her, Miss Marple felt certain the woman had been playing a part, one performed with the skill of someone who knew precisely what impression she wished to give. On her way back, she turned into a narrow lane that led toward the Feltons' cottage. Mrs. Felton was in her front garden, pruning a rosebush. At the mention of Maggie's visit, her face grew troubled. "She told you about the cracked apple, then?" Mrs. Felton said, lowering her voice. "I told her she was making too much of it. But, well, I don't know. Caroline Price has a way of choosing things. Always the best chair, the largest slice. If she picked that apple deliberately, she'd have had her reasons." Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile. "And if someone knew she would choose it? Someone who understands her habits?" Mrs. Felton blinked. "Oh, I hadn't thought of that." Miss Marple had. People often acted in patterns, and such predictability could be exploited. That afternoon, she decided to observe rather than inquire. She took her knitting to the bench near the village green, where she could see the comings and goings of most of St. Mildred's. The constable passed twice, first in the direction of the mill house, later toward the post office. Dr. Greenaway cycled by, his satchel bumping against his hip. Mrs. Hartwell, in a navy coat and smart hat, paused to chat with two ladies outside the grocer's. Her expression earnest, her hands gesturing in small, precise movements. It was Maggie's appearance, however, that drew Miss Marple's interest. The girl emerged from the side lane near the vicarage, her arms full of laundry. She stopped to speak to Alfie Marks, the young man from the apple press. Their conversation was brief, but Miss Marple noticed the way Alfie glanced over his shoulder, as if checking who might be watching. Patterns, she reminded herself. They were everywhere, if one knew how to see them. By early evening, a fine rain had begun to fall, soft enough to blur the outlines of the houses and dim the glow of the street lamps. Miss Marple closed her curtains and settled by the fire, her mind turning over the day's observations. Caroline Price's composure, the cracked apple, the possibility of someone anticipating her choice. It was all beginning to form a shape. But the shape was incomplete. One piece, she was sure, lay hidden in the orchard itself. People's eyes had been on Harold Price as he fell, but she wondered if anyone had looked closely at the moments before. Where he stood, who stood nearest, what small exchanges might have passed unnoticed. The orchard was empty now, its grass damp and strewn with windfalls. In the fading light, she walked the path between the trees, her eyes scanning the ground. Near the spot where Harold had fallen, she paused. The grass was slightly flattened, as if someone had stood there for a time. A few feet away, beneath a tree, she saw something small and glinting. A hat pin, its head set with a tiny pearl. Miss Marple bent and picked it up, turning it over in her gloved fingers. A woman's pin, dropped perhaps in haste. It could belong to anyone, but she remembered Mrs. Hartwell's fondness for pearl-topped pins and her presence near the cider table that day. As she slipped the pin into her pocket, the first true thread of the pattern tightened in her mind. If the apple had been prepared in advance, it had been placed where Caroline Price would be the one to take it. But perhaps the real question was not who handed it to Harold, but who made certain it reached Caroline's hand first. Back at her cottage, she set the pin on the table beside her knitting. The rain tapped softly at the windows, and the fire cast a steady glow. Somewhere in the village, she knew, the person responsible for Harold Price's death was confident they had acted without flaw. Miss Marple smiled faintly. In her experience, such confidence was always the beginning of a mistake. The next day brought a brisk wind that set the hedgerows shivering and sent a scatter of russet leaves tumbling across the village lanes. Miss Marple, taking her morning walk toward the high street, felt that the weather had put a certain edge on the village's mood. People were quicker in their movements, their conversations brisker, as though the wind might snatch away their words if they lingered too long. Outside the bakery, Mrs. Hartwell stood in animated discussion with Mrs. Sims, the schoolmistress. She was dressed smartly as always, her navy coat buttoned to the chin, her hat pinned firmly in place, though Miss Marple noted with a flicker of interest that today's hat bore a simple ribbon and no sign of the pearl-headed pin she favored. "Ah, Miss Marple," Mrs. Hartwell called, her tone warm but her eyes sharp. "Have you heard? They say the police from the county are sending a detective down. Quite the fuss over one man's unfortunate apple." Miss Marple allowed herself a small, polite smile. "Well, poison is rather more than unfortunate, don't you think?" Mrs. Hartwell's lips pressed together briefly. "I suppose so. Still, you mark my words, it'll come to nothing. Some outsider with a grudge or a business deal gone sour. We've no murderers in St. Mildred's." Miss Marple murmured something agreeable and moved on. But she kept the exchange tucked neatly in her mind. The vehement denial of murder in the village was a familiar refrain. Yet she had learned it was often sung loudest by those who feared the truth might be otherwise. At the greengrocer's, she found Alfie Marks weighing potatoes. The young man looked startled when she greeted him. "Oh, Miss Marple. Afternoon." She spoke of the weather first, then of the apple harvest, letting the conversation drift naturally toward the fair. "It must have been quite a shock for you," she said gently, "being so near when poor Mr. Price collapsed." Alfie nodded. "It was. One minute he's joking about the press, next minute, bang, drops like a sack. I keep seeing it, even when I'm trying to sleep." "And before that moment, did you notice anyone paying him special attention?" Alfie frowned, thinking. Not really. Except maybe Mrs. Hartwell. She came over while he was eating that apple. Said something to him, I couldn't hear what. And then she walked off. He laughed, but it wasn't... Well, it didn't sound like he found it very funny. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her shopping basket. "And Mrs. Price? Where was she?" "Right beside him, of course. She gave him the apple." The picture was clarifying, though not enough to frame. She thanked Alfie and left, her mind turning over this new scrap. By mid-afternoon, the county detective had indeed arrived. A tall, sandy-haired man named Inspector Graves. Miss Marple caught sight of him speaking to the constable outside the vicarage, his manner efficient but genial. She knew his type, thorough with facts, impatient with what he might dismiss as village talk. She doubted he would think to connect a misplaced hatpin with a poisoned apple, but she had no intention of pressing the matter on him just yet. Instead, she decided to see Maggie. The girl was hanging washing in her mother's back garden, her cheeks flushed from the wind. "You've been a help to me already," Miss Marple began. "But I wonder if you remember anything more about the moment Mrs. Price bought that apple." Maggie hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the house. Well, I did notice Mrs. Hartwell hanging about. She was looking at the apples, not buying anything, just looking. Then Mrs. Price came up, and Mrs. Hartwell said something, like she was recommending one. She even pointed, I think. Then Mrs. Price smiled and took the one with the crack. "That's very helpful, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. But inside, the pattern shifted into sharper focus. If Mrs. Hartwell had drawn Caroline's attention to that particular apple, she could have done so knowing exactly what it was. And if Caroline then handed it to Harold, well, the chain was complete. But the motive was still an open question. Mrs. Hartwell was a widow of comfortable means, well regarded in the village, and as far as Miss Marple knew, she had no business quarrels with Harold Price. Personal reasons, then? Resentments? Jealousies? That evening, Miss Marple invited Cherry, her housekeeper, to take tea in the parlor. Over seed cake, she steered the conversation toward the Prices. Cherry, always pleased to contribute to village intelligence, leaned forward eagerly. "Funny thing," Cherry said, "but I heard from Mrs. Sims that before Caroline came here, she and Harold lived somewhere near Brighton, and Mrs. Hartwell's sister, she lives in Brighton too. They might have known each other before St. Mildred's, indeed," Miss Marple murmured, pouring more tea. Cherry nodded. "And you know what they say about Mrs. Hartwell. Once took a liking to a man who didn't return it. If Harold was, well, friendly and then not, perhaps she didn't take it well." It was conjecture, but it fit snugly into the frame Miss Marple was building. A woman scorned, a public event, a means of revenge executed with care. Poison required forethought, and the knowledge that someone else could be maneuvered into delivering it. The following morning, Miss Marple dressed for a visit to Mrs. Hartwell. She brought a small jar of her own raspberry jam as a neighborly pretext. The Hartwell sitting room was warm, scented faintly of beeswax and lavender, its mantel crowded with photographs of relatives. "How kind of you, Miss Marple," Mrs. Hartwell said, accepting the jam. "Please do sit down. I've been quite at 6s and 7s since the fair. Such a dreadful thing to happen." "Yes," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair. "And such a public place for it. One imagines the killer must have been quite sure of their plan." Mrs. Hartwell's eyes flickered, just for a moment. "If you believe there was a killer, it could have been an accident. Possibly. But Dr. Greenaway seemed quite certain about the poison. And then there's the curious matter of a hatpin I happened upon in the orchard. A pearl-headed one, very like those you wear." Mrs. Hartwell's hand went instinctively to her hat, which today bore only its ribbon. "Oh? I must have dropped it. In the very place Harold Price collapsed." Mrs. Hartwell smiled, but it was thin. "I was nearby, yes. Talking to Mrs. Price, as it happens." Miss Marple regarded her gently. "And recommending a particular apple?" Mrs. Hartwell's composure faltered, the smile fading. "If I did, it was only because it looked a little imperfect. And Caroline, well, she likes to take the best for herself. I thought it would be amusing. To watch her hand her husband a poisoned apple?" The other woman's eyes widened. "You think I—" "Really, Miss Marple, you've quite an imagination." Miss Marple rose, her manner still as mild as when she entered. "One learns to observe people, Mrs. Hartwell, and one learns that the smallest gestures, pointing out an apple standing just so, can sometimes have the gravest consequences." She left without pressing further. A direct accusation now would only close doors, but she felt sure the hatpin had struck home. Mrs. Hartwell's reaction had been too sharp, her denial too swift. That night, as the wind rattled the windows and the fire burned low, Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her lap, her thoughts looping as neatly as her stitches. She could almost see it. The cracked apple, prepared in advance, placed where Mrs. Hartwell could draw Caroline Price's eye to it. Caroline, oblivious, or perhaps not, handing it to her husband. Harold biting in, laughing at some private remark, then crumpling to the ground. What she could not yet see was whether Caroline had been pawn or partner in the act. But that, Miss Marple thought with quiet satisfaction, would soon be clear. For if there was one thing she had learned in all her years, it was that two guilty people rarely trusted each other for long. And when trust cracked, like sugar over an apple, the truth beneath was quick to spill out. The following morning, the wind had dropped, leaving the air cold and still, as if the village were holding its breath. From her parlor window, Miss Marple watched the frost cling to the rooftops and hedgerows, a thin silver sheen that would melt by midday. The stillness suited her mood. It was a day for listening, not acting. She was convinced now that both Caroline Price and Mrs. Hartwell were bound to the crime in some fashion. But the nature of that bond, witting or unwitting, remained veiled. She began her morning with a small errand to the vicarage, carrying a basket of scones. The Reverend Pottle was out, but Mrs. Pottle was at home and, as Miss Marple expected, eager for company. They spoke first of parish matters, then of the inquest, and Mrs. Pottle's eyes brightened in that particular way people's did when they were about to pass along a tidbit they found too delicious to keep. "You know," she said, lowering her voice though they were quite alone, "I happened to see Mrs. Hartwell and Mrs. Price together not long before the fair. In the lane by the mill house, of all places." They were speaking rather sharply. Well, Mrs. Price was, at any rate. Something about staying out of her affairs and not daring to meddle. Mrs. Hartwell looked quite ruffled. Miss Marple listened with a faint nod, not pressing for more. Sometimes, when the information was ripe enough, it came unbidden. She left soon after, walking slowly down the lane, her mind turning over this new fragment. A quarrel before the fair, public even if overheard only by one person, suggested tension. And tension was a ready breeding ground for malice. On the green, she encountered Inspector Graves in conversation with the constable. He touched his hat politely to her. "Miss Marple, I've been looking into Mr. Price's affairs, and you were quite right. He had business interests outside the village. Investments, a bit of property speculation. Some of it wasn't entirely above board, from what I gather. Ambition often takes people into troubled waters," Miss Marple said mildly. "And does your investigation cast any light on his domestic arrangements?" The inspector's mouth twitched. "Well, Mrs. Price stands to gain a tidy sum from his death. Life insurance, jointly held investments. That could be motive enough. Though I've no proof she knew anything about the poison. And there's Mrs. Hartwell. Connections to Brighton, through her sister, who knew the Prices slightly. I've not found a clear link yet." Miss Marple let that sit. She had no desire to seem too well informed. Men like Graves preferred to believe they arrived at conclusions unaided. But his remark confirmed her sense that money and past acquaintance were threads in this tangle. That afternoon, she decided to call at the Feltons once more, using the pretext of returning a borrowed jar. Maggie answered the door, her hair wind-blown from some outdoor errand. When Miss Marple inquired after her, the girl hesitated. "It's only—" "Well, I've been thinking about that day," Maggie said. "And I remembered. Mrs. Hartwell had gloves on at the fair, pale ones. But when she pointed out that apple to Mrs. Price, she took one glove off. Said she wanted to feel the fruit." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her tone remained gentle. "Did she indeed?" "Yes. And she was holding something in her other hand. A handkerchief, maybe. Or, well, I don't know. But it seemed odd. It was more than odd. It was suggestive. Handling the apple bare-handed would make it easier to apply something to the crack in the sugar, unnoticed among the bustle. Miss Marple thanked Maggie warmly, assured her she had done the right thing, and took her leave. The light was fading when she returned home, but she didn't light her lamp straight away. Instead, she sat in her chair by the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames as the pieces arranged themselves in her mind. Mrs. Hartwell had motive. Some past connection to Harold, possibly a grievance. And she had means. The poison could have been applied quickly, just before Caroline arrived at the stall. Caroline's part was less certain. Had she been an innocent dupe, steered toward the apple and used to deliver it? Or had she understood precisely what she was doing, the gesture of offering it to her husband masking something colder? Miss Marple thought of Caroline's composure at the inquest, her calculated remarks about Harold's affairs lying beyond the village. Such detachment could be grief's armor, or it could be the cool self-possession of someone ensuring suspicion slid elsewhere. The next morning, she attended the weekly sewing circle at Mrs. Briggs's. These gatherings, ostensibly about mending altar cloths and stitching for charity, were fertile ground for observation. Conversation flowed easily among the clatter of scissors and the rustle of fabric. Mrs. Sims, threading a needle with great deliberation, remarked, "Funny thing, but I saw Mrs. Price at the railway station a week before the fair. She wasn't going anywhere, just meeting someone off the London train, a gentleman, tall, dark coat. They spoke only a moment, then walked away separately." Miss Marple's fingers kept their steady rhythm on the hem she was finishing, but her mind pricked to attention. A gentleman from London, a week before Harold's death, meeting Caroline in secret. It was a new variable, one that might explain her air of quiet confidence. If she had help, perhaps the poison had not come from Mrs. Hartwell at all. Or perhaps, in some convoluted twist, the two women had unknowingly conspired toward the same end. By the time she left the sewing circle, Miss Marple's curiosity was sharpened to a fine point. She decided to test the waters. That afternoon, she called at the mill house again, bringing a small posy of late chrysanthemums. Caroline received her in the drawing room, where a faint scent of roses lingered. "I do hope you're keeping well," Miss Marple began. "One hears so many things in a village, and I wondered if I might put a question plainly to you." Caroline's smile was faint and cool. "Of course, if you wish. Were you acquainted with Mrs. Hartwell before you came to St. Mildred's?" The question, delivered in Miss Marple's mildest tone, made Caroline's eyes narrow almost imperceptibly. "No more than anyone else here. Why do you ask?" "Oh, idle curiosity," Miss Marple said, setting the flowers in a vase on the side table. "Only one does notice when people have strong opinions about each other." Caroline's chin lifted slightly. "Mrs. Hartwell and I have had our differences, but Harold's death has nothing to do with her." It was a curious defense, denying not the possibility of murder, but Mrs. Hartwell's involvement. When Miss Marple took her leave, she was more convinced than ever that Caroline's knowledge of events was deeper than she cared to admit. That evening, she wrote a short note to Inspector Graves, requesting a private word. She did not intend to reveal all yet, but she wanted him primed to act when the time came. In her mind, the orchard scene replayed in slow motion. Mrs. Hartwell removing her glove, Caroline approaching, the cracked apple selected, the smooth handover to Harold. The laughter, the bite, the collapse. Whether the two women had acted in concert or by coincidence, The sequence was too precise to be chance. She poured herself a cup of tea, the steam curling upward in the lamplight. In another day or two, she decided, she would contrive to bring both Caroline and Mrs. Hartwell into the same room. It would need to seem accidental, an innocent gathering where conversation could drift, where one might drop a remark and watch the ripples it made. For now, she let the plan settle like tea leaves in a pot. The truth, she knew, was nearly within reach. And when it came, it would fall with the quiet inevitability of an apple dropping from its branch, the weight of its ripeness too much for the stem to hold. 2 days later, Miss Marple put her plan into motion. It began with a few calls and a little artful arranging. A sewing circle needed volunteers for the church bazaar preparations, she explained to Mrs. Hartwell. There were tablecloths to be hemmed and stall arrangements to be discussed. Caroline Price, meanwhile, was invited under the pretext of advising on the floral displays. "Your taste is so very refined, my dear." Both women agreed, unaware that the other would be present. The gathering was set for a Thursday afternoon in the vicarage drawing room, chosen for its bright windows and the vicar's willingness to lend the space for any respectable village endeavor. Miss Marple arrived early, ostensibly to help arrange chairs and prepare the tea service, but in truth to choose her seat with care, a place where she could observe both women without seeming to watch them. Mrs. Hartwell was first to arrive, impeccably turned out in a deep green coat with a modest hat. Her expression softened only fractionally when she saw Miss Marple. She clearly believed she had been invited for the sake of her sewing skills. Caroline Price followed soon after, a fur-collared coat framing her face, her smile poised and cool. There was a flicker of surprise in her eyes when she spotted Mrs. Hartwell, quickly smoothed into polite indifference. "My dear," Miss Marple said warmly, rising to greet her, "how fortunate you could both come. We shall be all the more efficient for the extra hands." Tea was poured, scissors and needles distributed, and the work began. For a time, the room was filled with the small domestic sounds of thread being drawn through cloth and cups set gently on saucers. Conversation meandered through safe topics: the weather, the price of butter, the success of the harvest fair stalls. Miss Marple allowing each woman the comfort of thinking the meeting was just as it seemed. Then, with the air of one making a casual remark, she said, "It is a pity the fair ended so abruptly. I had hoped to see the apple press demonstration in full. I understand you were both near it when the unpleasantness occurred." Mrs. Hartwell's needle paused mid-stitch. "Yes, I was there for a time," she said, keeping her eyes on the cloth. "I remember speaking to Harold briefly. And you, Mrs. Price?" "I was beside my husband," Caroline replied evenly. "I bought him a toffee apple." Miss Marple's tone was gentle, almost absent-minded. "For Mrs. Felton's stall, wasn't it? Such a charming display. I do remember there was one apple with a little crack in the sugar. It seemed a pity. It must have been more difficult to wrap." Mrs. Hartwell gave the smallest of glances toward Caroline. Caroline did not return it, but the way she set down her teacup was just a fraction too deliberate. "Oh, I never noticed," Caroline said. "That is odd," Miss Marple continued mildly, "for I happened to hear from young Maggie that you were directed to that very apple by someone who remarked upon its imperfection." Silence settled like a fine dust over the table. Mrs. Hartwell's jaw tightened. Caroline's gaze stayed fixed on the flowers arranged at the far end of the room. Miss Marple let the pause stretch a moment before adding, "I also came upon a hat pin under the apple boughs. not far from where Harold fell. A pearl-headed one, very like the kind you wear, Mrs. Hartwell. Mrs. Hartwell's lips parted, then closed again. If I dropped it, it was by accident. You can't possibly think— I think, Miss Marple said softly, that someone applied poison to that apple just moments before Mrs. Price arrived. Someone who could be certain Mrs. Price would take it, either from knowing her habits or from ensuring she did. The tension between the two women became almost tangible, a fine thread stretched to breaking. Caroline was the first to speak, her voice low and controlled. If you are suggesting that I knew what was on that apple, you are mistaken. I trusted what I was given. Mrs. Hartwell let out a short, mirthless laugh. Trusted? Or were you simply pleased to have the opportunity? And what would you know of my opportunities? Caroline's composure had thinned. There was steel in her words now. Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on each of them. You both had reason to dislike Harold Price. You both had opportunity. The question is whether you acted together, or whether one of you made the other your unwitting accomplice. The vicar's wife, bustling in with a fresh pot of tea, broke the moment. Both women smoothed their expressions, accepting refills with polite murmurs. But the current between them was altered. When the gathering broke up an hour later, Miss Marple lingered in the porch to watch them leave. Mrs. Hartwell walked away briskly, without a backward glance. Caroline followed at a measured pace, her gloved hands tight around her handbag. That evening, Miss Marple was paid a visit by Inspector Graves. I had a word with Mrs. Felton, he said. She recalled something. Mrs. Hartwell was at her stall just before Mrs. Price arrived. Said she was looking over the apples, didn't buy anything. Could fit your theory. It could, Miss Marple agreed. But there's something more. Mrs. Price met a gentleman from London a week before the fair. If he supplied the poison, it could mean she and Mrs. Hartwell were playing separate games with the same piece. Graves frowned. Separate games. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. If Mrs. Hartwell intended Caroline to be the instrument of Harold's death, she may have thought Caroline innocent. If Caroline already had her own plan, then Mrs. Hartwell's interference merely made success more certain. The irony is that each might think herself the sole author. The inspector's brows lifted. And how do we prove it? Miss Marple's smile was faint. By letting them try to prove it to each other. Pride is often a sharper spur than fear. Over the next 2 days, she set her final stage. A rumor was allowed to drift through the village that the police had narrowed their list to 2 suspects, both women, both seen near the apple stall. The rumor said nothing of names, but St. Mildred's was small, and conclusions were easily drawn. On the 3rd morning, Mrs. Hartwell was seen at the post office, speaking sharply to Mrs. Briggs. That afternoon, Caroline Price called at the vicarage under some thin pretext. By evening, word had reached Miss Marple via Cherry that the 2 women had been overheard in a heated exchange near the green. When she strolled there herself the next morning, she found the frost crisp underfoot and the air clear. Caroline and Mrs. Hartwell stood by the lich gate, their voices low but urgent. Miss Marple, apparently absorbed in examining the church notice board, caught just enough to hear Mrs. Hartwell say, "And if they search your things, they'll find it." Caroline's reply was sharper. "If they do, it will be because you put it there." It was confirmation enough. Both were entangled. Both feared the other might turn first. Miss Marple walked away, her step light despite the chill. The end was near, and soon, she knew, the weight of their own mistrust would do the work for her. Back at her cottage, she took the hatpin from her writing desk drawer, turning it over once before setting it carefully in a small envelope. It was not the whole of the proof, but in her experience, the smallest piece, presented at the right moment, could be the one that made the rest of the picture impossible to deny. She poured herself a cup of tea, the steam curling upward in the lamplight. Outside, the branches of the apple trees were bare now, their fruit long gathered, but she could still see in her mind the scene beneath them. A bright, cracked sweet, a man's easy smile, and the fatal bite that had bound two women together in the most dangerous of alliances. And soon, she thought, that alliance would splinter. When it did, she would be there to watch the pieces fall. It was the following afternoon when Miss Marple decided that the moment had come to bring matters to a head. The two women's quarrel at the Lich Gate had been all the confirmation she needed. Their alliance, if indeed it had ever been one, was crumbling under the weight of suspicion. When mutual trust is gone, the guilty often hurry to secure their own position by turning on each other. All that was required was a careful nudge. She began with Mrs. Hartwell. A short note, delivered by Cherry under the guise of returning a borrowed cake tin, invited her to tea the next day at 3:30. Caroline Price received a similar note, couched in equally warm and innocuous terms. Neither would suspect that the other had been invited. The parlor was prepared with a kind of understated precision. Tea service polished, fire bright, seed cake cut, and two chairs placed at slight angles so that each woman would be obliged to look toward the other. Miss Marple had learned long ago that a carefully arranged room could do almost as much work as carefully chosen words. Mrs. Hartwell arrived first, composed and a little wary. Caroline came only minutes later, her smile polite but cool when she realized they were not to have Miss Marple's company exclusively. "How pleasant to have you both," Miss Marple said, seating herself where she could observe them clearly. "I've been meaning to speak with you about the fair, purely in the interest of clearing the air. It's such a pity when misunderstandings are allowed to fester." The women exchanged guarded glances, but said nothing. Miss Marple poured tea with a steady hand. "You see," she continued in her mildest voice, "the constable has been most diligent, and the inspector from the county has taken a great interest. He tells me the matter is close to being resolved." Caroline's fingers tightened on her cup. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes flickered briefly toward her handbag. Miss Marple set down the teapot. "The curious thing," she went on, "is that the evidence seems to point to both of you. Each of you present at the apple stall, each of you close to Harold Price at the crucial moment. It does make one wonder whether the act was shared or, shall we say, sequential." The silence was taut. Caroline was the first to break it. "If you are implying that I had any knowledge of what was on that apple, you are wrong. I was handed it, and I passed it to my husband, nothing more." Mrs. Hartwell gave a dry, disbelieving laugh. "Handed it, yes, after I saw you looking at it like a cat with a saucer of cream. Don't pretend you didn't know exactly what you were doing." Caroline turned to her sharply. "And how, pray, would I have known? Unless you mean to admit that you were the one who prepared it?" Mrs. Hartwell's color rose. "Prepared? That's an ugly word. I might have pointed it out, yes, but only because it was imperfect. I thought you'd pass it over, not—" She stopped herself. Too late. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her words were deliberate. "And why would you point it out at all? Unless you wished it to be chosen." Mrs. Hartwell pressed her lips together. Caroline leaned back slightly, her tone turning icy. Perhaps because she knew exactly what it was. Perhaps she thought I would be blamed if anything happened. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Or perhaps, she said gently, you each had reasons of your own, and the result was a fortunate coincidence, at least from the perspective of the one who hated Harold Price most. That landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. Caroline's gaze hardened. I had no cause to hate my husband. We had an understanding. Mrs. Hartwell's laugh was sharp. An understanding. He was making arrangements to sell you out of that mill house and take his profits elsewhere. Everyone knew what Harold was like with money. And you, Caroline said, her voice low, were quite content to spend your afternoons in his company before deciding you didn't care for the terms of his attention. Mrs. Hartwell's cheeks flushed. That is a filthy insinuation. I wonder, Miss Marple said, still in that same even tone, if the gentleman from London, whom Mrs. Price met a week before the fair, might have supplied her with something suitable for her purpose. Just as I wonder whether Mrs. Hartwell, having her own grievance, decided to put such a thing to use herself. Both women turned to her, startled. Miss Marple met their eyes in turn. It would be an unusual crime to have two hands unknowingly commit the same act on the same object. Unusual, but not impossible. One woman, thinking herself the sole author, is dismayed to find her work preempted by another. Caroline's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Mrs. Hartwell's fingers gripped the arm of her chair. I found your hatpin, Mrs. Hartwell, in the orchard. Miss Marple went on. Near enough to where Harold Price fell to suggest you were standing very close indeed. And Maggie remembers you removing your glove to handle the fruit. That would be the perfect moment to apply something quickly to the crack in the sugar. And Mrs. Price, she said, turning to Caroline, there is the small matter of your conversation with that gentleman from London. I dare say Inspector Graves could discover his identity if he were to confirm that you had obtained a certain substance. The threat was left hanging in the air, unspoken but clear. Both women now sat utterly still, each measuring the other, calculating whether to deny, to confess, or to accuse. It was Mrs. Hartwell who broke first. I only meant to frighten him, she said suddenly, the words spilling out. A little sickness, nothing fatal. I didn't know it would kill him so quickly. And I thought, well, Caroline was always so smug. I thought if she was seen handing it to him. Caroline's eyes flashed. You fool. He would have died anyway. You think you did it, but I made sure of it. I knew exactly what I was giving him. The silence after that was complete. The fire crackled in the grate. A clock ticked softly on the mantel. Miss Marple did not smile, but there was a certain stillness in her that came when the last piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. I see, she said quietly. So it was indeed a joint effort, though not by design. One poisoned apple, touched twice over. Harold Price never stood a chance. She rose, setting down her teacup. I shall leave you to consider how best to explain this to Inspector Graves. I have no doubt he will be most interested to hear which of you prefers to tell the full story first. Neither woman moved as Miss Marple showed them to the door, each too wrapped in her own thoughts. She knew they would not stay silent for long. Pride and self-preservation would see to that. When they had gone, she sat by the fire once more, the evening light fading beyond the lace curtains. The outcome was inevitable now. By nightfall, one or both would be speaking to the inspector, eager to secure the better bargain. And in the stillness, she allowed herself the smallest sigh. It It was a bitter thing, perhaps, that justice here would be served not by loyalty or remorse, but by the same human frailty that had led to the crime itself. Yet it was always thus, she thought. In the end, people reveal themselves, not out of virtue, but because they cannot help it. The next morning, St. Mildred's awoke to the faint chime of the church clock under a pale winter sun. The frost lay heavier than before, whitening the hedgerows and turning the green to silver. Miss Marple rose early, her mind already made up. Today the matter would end. She had not expected to wait long, and indeed she did not. At 9:30, the sound of boots on the path announced Inspector Graves. He carried himself with the air of a man who had been woken early by urgent news. "I think we've reached the point you were expecting, Miss Marple," he said without preamble once she'd shown him in. "We had Mrs. Hartwell in at the station first thing. Claims she acted alone, but her story doesn't match the evidence." Barely an hour later, Mrs. Price arrived, demanding to be heard before that Hartwell woman ruined her reputation. "The result is exactly what you told me might happen. They've both implicated each other." Miss Marple poured him tea, her expression serene. "And did they confirm what I suspected, that each acted independently?" Graves nodded grimly. "Hartwell says she carried a small vial of something bitter. Claims it was meant to cause a stomach upset, nothing more. She handled the apple, applied it to the crack, then stepped away. Price, for her part, says she'd acquired cyanide from a man in London, her late husband's business associate, though she won't give his name. She'd intended to use it at the fair, and when she saw Hartwell pointing out the cracked apple, she took it as an opportunity. She already had her own preparation in her bag. Each one swears the other is lying about the lethal dose, but the coroner's tests show both substances present." "It is extraordinary," Miss Marple said softly, "how rarely people's malice runs in only one direction. Often it flows out toward more than one target, and so it doubles back." Graves leaned back in his chair. "If it hadn't been for that poor devil of a husband, they might have carried on their little feud for years without crossing the line. As it is, they both face a hanging offense. I suppose I ought to thank you for the way you encouraged their conversation yesterday." Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. One must never underestimate the effect of a few well-placed truths in the right company. By mid-morning, the village was humming. News had spread with its usual swiftness, leaping from the post office to the grocer's, from the green to the farthest cottages. In the tea shop, Mrs. Briggs was holding court with the relish of one who had always said there was something off about both women. Mrs. Sims, meanwhile, told anyone who'd listened that she'd known it would come to poison from the start, though her earlier theories had centered on cider gone bad. Miss Marple did not join in. She preferred to move quietly through the day, answering the occasional neighbor's question with a vague remark and a thoughtful look. Let them imagine what they liked. The truth, she knew, was often too odd to be believed without proof. That afternoon, she paid a visit to the orchard. The grass was brittle underfoot, the bare boughs rattling faintly in the breeze. She walked to the place where Harold Price had fallen, picturing again the bright shards of sugar against the damp grass, the sudden collapse, the startled cry. How many crimes, she wondered, had begun with such a small, seemingly harmless object? She found herself reflecting, too, on Harold Price himself. A man neither universally liked nor entirely despised. A man who had carried his own share of secrets and schemes. His death had been swift, but the currents that had led to it had run deep and for some time. Such things did not happen overnight. They were cultivated, like the orchard itself, until the fruit was ready to drop. In the days that followed, the official machinery of justice began its slow turn. The coroner amended his findings. The magistrate scheduled hearings. The inspector came and went from the village with the brisk tread of a man who preferred straightforward cases to ones with so many human entanglements. Mrs. Hartwell and Caroline Price were remanded in custody, their homes shuttered and silent. St. Mildred's, in its way, began to settle back into its rhythm. The harvest fair was spoken of in the past tense, as though it belonged to some distant, self-contained season. The cider barrels were rolled away, the bunting folded, the apple press stored until next year. Yet beneath the calm, there lingered an undercurrent of unease, not from fear, but from the reminder that murder had happened here, in the open, among familiar faces. One evening, a week after the arrests, Miss Marple was visited by Dr. Greenaway. He accepted her offer of tea and settled by the fire, looking more relaxed than she had seen him since the day of the fair. "You were right from the beginning," he said, shaking his head. "I was thinking only of the poison itself. But you looked at the people. Without that, we might still be looking for a single culprit and missing the truth entirely." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Human behavior is the most reliable evidence we have, Doctor. One only needs to notice the small, consistent habits, and then see who can be relied upon to act according to them." He chuckled. "Well, you certainly noticed. And what do you make of them now, those two?" "They will each tell themselves they acted for a reason," she said. "Mrs. Hartwell to humiliate or unsettle, Mrs. Price to free herself from a man she no longer wished to endure. But in the end, the reason matters less than the willingness to do harm. Once that line is crossed, there's no going back." When the doctor left, Miss Marple sat for a while in the quiet, the fire casting gentle light over the parlor. The matter was closed in the eyes of the law, yet her thoughts lingered on the peculiar symmetry of it all. Two separate strands of malice meeting on the same day, at the same place, on the same object. It was almost poetic, in a grim way. The next morning, she took a short walk through the village, stopping at the churchyard gate. Frost still edged the grass, and the church bell chimed the hour. She stood for a moment, taking in the familiar rooftops, the curling smoke from chimneys, the way the light caught on the bare branches of the orchard beyond. Life, as it always did, was moving on. As she turned toward home, she passed Maggie, who greeted her shyly. "It's all over now, isn't it, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Over in one sense, my dear. But people will remember. Not because of the trial or the punishment, but because they will wonder how close they came to being part of it, by standing in the wrong place or handing over the wrong thing." Maggie nodded slowly, as though committing this to memory. Miss Marple watched her go, thinking how quickly innocence could brush against danger without ever knowing it. Back at her cottage, she set her basket down and looked once more at the envelope on her writing desk, the one containing the pearl-headed hatpin. It was no longer needed as evidence. Inspector Graves had assured her it would be returned in due course. She slipped it into a drawer, not as a keepsake, but as a quiet reminder. Later, as she settled into her chair with her knitting, she thought again of the orchard, the apple boughs now bare. Spring would come, the blossoms would return, and the village would once more gather under them for the fair. There would be laughter and chatter, and perhaps even a toffee apple or two. And no one, not even those who had whispered most eagerly, would speak openly of Harold Price. But Miss Marple would remember, as she always did. She would remember the crack in the sugar, the removal of a glove, the quiet rivalries and glances. The moment two separate designs, met on one sweet red apple. And she would remember, too, that evil in a village seldom comes in the form people expect. It is more often a thing of small gestures, careful timing, and the certainty that no one is truly watching. She smiled to herself, the fire's warmth steady against the winter chill. Human nature, she thought, was as perennial as the seasons. The orchard would bear again, and people would be much the same as they ever were, capable of kindness, of pettiness, and on rare and dangerous occasions, of murder beneath the apple boughs. A fortnight after the arrests, St. Mildred's had returned, at least outwardly, to its quiet rhythms. The post office once more hummed with ordinary errands. The vicarage garden saw its first tentative winter blooms, and the smell of coal smoke hung comfortably in the air. Yet beneath the surface, there remained that faint, brittle caution, the kind that lingers after the village has been reminded that danger can sprout among its own hedgerows. Miss Marple had no illusions about the matter being forgotten entirely. Human memory might be selective, but it was also stubborn in its attachments. Years from now, when someone mentioned the harvest fair, there would always be the pause, the sidelong glance, before the conversation moved to safer ground. She had seen it before in other places, after other crimes. On a crisp Wednesday morning, she received a letter in the post. The handwriting was precise, almost severe. Inspector Graves. It was a short note informing her that both Mrs. Hartwell and Caroline Price had been formally charged with murder, their trials to be held in the spring assizes at the county town. The inspector also noted, with a faintly wry turn of phrase, that neither lady has shown the slightest inclination to shield the other. Quite the reverse, in fact. Miss Marple folded the letter neatly and placed it in a small drawer with other correspondence she kept for her own record. She did not keep such things for sentiment, but because she knew that patterns of behavior often outlast the events that provoked them. And sometimes it was useful to remember how a person had acted under pressure. That afternoon, she walked to the orchard. The trees were bare and still, their gnarled limbs dark against a pale sky. The grass was damp and scattered with the last of the windfalls, now soft and mottled. Standing there, she could almost see again the scene of the fair, the bunting, the chatter, the cider barrels, and beneath the apple boughs, the sudden knot of people around a body. Her thoughts, however, were not on the Prices or the Hartwells now, but on the smaller, quieter players in the affair. Maggie, for one, the girl whose simple observation about a cracked apple had proved so telling. Mrs. Felton, too, who would carry for some time the unease of having her stall be the unwitting stage for a murder. Such people, Miss Marple knew, often emerged from these episodes with a sharper sense of the world, sometimes for the better, sometimes not. On her way back, she encountered Mrs. Pottle, who was making her way home from the vicarage with a basket on her arm. So dreadful about those two women, Mrs. Pottle said, falling into step beside her. I cannot fathom how they could have done such a thing in the midst of a village gathering. Why, I was only a few yards away, and yet I never noticed a thing. Miss Marple's smile was faint. That is often how such things are done, my dear, right under the noses of those least inclined to suspect them. Mrs. Pottle sighed. And all over a man like Harold Price, I cannot imagine risking one's soul for the likes of him. They parted at the green, and Miss Marple continued home. She had heard such remarks before, often from those who privately enjoyed the scandal more than they would admit. But Mrs. Pottle's words contained a truth. Harold Price, for all his charm and schemes, was not the sort to inspire noble sacrifice, which perhaps made the crime all the more telling. It had been born not of grand passion, but of irritation, ambition, and a long memory for slights. 2 days later, Inspector Graves called again, this time not in the rush of duty, but at a more civil hour. He accepted tea and a slice of seed cake, settling into the chair by the fire. "I thought you'd like to know," he said. "We've traced the man from London, fellow by the name of Calthorpe, old business contact of Harold Price, and not above selling something dangerous, if the price was right. We've no proof he knew what Mrs. Price meant to do with it. But he's decided it's wiser to leave the country for a while." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Such men usually do. Trouble has a way of following them home otherwise. Graves chuckled. "And Hartwell?" "She still insists she only meant to make him ill. I'm not sure whether she believes it herself or just thinks it sounds better than the alternative. Either way, they'll both stand trial. I can't say which will fare worse in front of a jury." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "Jurors, in my experience, are not swayed solely by facts. They weigh what they can understand, and it is easier to believe in deliberate cruelty than in an accident of two cruelties at once." The inspector nodded. "I expect you're right. Still, it's a rare business. 2 women each trying to poison the same man without knowing the other was doing the same." "It is rare," Miss Marple agreed, "but not quite as rare as you might think. There's more than one way to find oneself in another person's path. And when 2 such paths cross, well, sometimes they lead to the same doorstep, at the same moment, with the same intent." When Graves had gone, Miss Marple sat for a while in the quiet, listening to the ticking of the clock. The village outside her window went about its life, and the world beyond St. Mildred's turned, as it always did. But for her, the affair under the apple boughs would remain another small proof of what she had always known. That human nature does not change. It dresses itself in different clothes, speaks in different voices, but its patterns are ancient and enduring. The following Sunday at church, she took her usual seat, noting as she did the slight shift in the congregation's arrangement. The pews once occupied by the Prices and Mrs. Hartwell now stood empty, as though no one quite wished to take them. During the hymn, she saw Maggie with her mother near the back, singing softly, her eyes occasionally straying to where Miss Marple sat. After the service, Maggie shyly approached. "They said, at the shop, you were the one who figured it out," the girl murmured. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I only listened, my dear. And you were the one who noticed the most important thing. Never think small details don't matter." Maggie's face lit with a small, proud smile before she hurried off. Miss Marple watched her go, thinking that perhaps the girl had gained something valuable, an understanding that careful observation was not idle nosiness, but a kind of quiet armor. Back at her cottage, she made herself a pot of tea and sat by the window, watching the pale afternoon light touch the orchard in the distance. Winter still held the trees bare, but in a few months the branches would be heavy with blossom again, and the village would gather once more beneath them. Life, as it always did, would carry on. Yet in her mind's eye, Miss Marple could still see that day. The crack in the sugar, the removal of a glove, the quick exchange of glances, the laughter that masked the moment before the end. She had learned long ago not to dwell over much on such images, but neither did she forget them. They were part of the quiet ledger she kept, not in writing, but in memory, of the many ways in which people revealed themselves when they thought no one was watching. The wind shifted outside, stirring the bare branches, and she drew her shawl more closely around her shoulders. The case of Harold Price was closed, but the orchard would always hold the shadow of what had happened there. And Miss Marple, as ever, would be ready for the next time the still surface of village life rippled to show what lay beneath. The weeks rolled on, each one smoothing over the sharper edges of the affair until it became part of the village's fabric, a thread of darker hue woven into the everyday pattern. The trial date was set for the spring, and though most of St. Mildred's professed no wish to attend, there was an unspoken certainty that many would make the journey to the county town, if only to see for themselves how justice would be measured. For Miss Marple, life resumed its usual quiet cadence. Her days were filled with small routines, tending to her garden, visiting friends, attending parish meetings. Yet there was a subtle shift beneath the surface. People now seemed to watch her a little more closely, as though half expecting her to notice something about them too. It was not an unpleasant attention, rather like the deference one gives to a village elder whose judgment has been quietly proven correct. One morning, she received another letter from Inspector Graves, written in his brisk, matter-of-fact hand. It confirmed that both women had entered pleas of not guilty, and that the Crown intended to present them as co-defendants. Neither is willing to admit the other's role as more than an accessory, the letter read. It will be for the jury to decide how two separate intentions converged into one fatal act. Miss Marple folded the letter and tucked it away. It was no surprise to her. Human nature, she knew, seldom allowed for generous admissions where blame might be shared. The village's rhythm quickened slightly as spring approached. New shoots appeared in the hedgerows, and lambs dotted the fields beyond the church. In the orchard, the first pale blossoms trembled on the boughs, a promise of fruit to come. Miss Marple passed by one afternoon, her eyes drawn instinctively to the place where Harold Price had fallen. The grass there looked no different from anywhere else, yet she knew that memory clung to such spots in ways invisible to the eye. She met Mrs. Pottle on the path, who was gathering wild primroses. "The trees are coming along beautifully," Mrs. Pottle said. "Perhaps this year's fair will be a happier one." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, though her tone was gently non-committal. She had lived too long to believe that the presence of blossoms alone could promise a peaceful season. At the post office a few days later, Mrs. Briggs leaned over the counter to confide in Miss Marple. "Between you and me, I don't think either of them will tell the truth in court. Oh, they'll talk plenty, but not the truth, not the sort you can pin down with evidence. You watch, there'll be some twist before it's over." Miss Marple only smiled. Twists were inevitable. The human need to control the story of one's own actions was as strong as any instinct. On a blustery Saturday, she was visited by Maggie, the Feltons' helper. The girl was shy at first, standing on the threshold with her hands clasped. "Mum says I should thank you, proper-like," Maggie said. "She says if it weren't for me telling you about the apple, maybe they wouldn't have been caught." Miss Marple ushered her in for tea. "You did notice something important," she agreed. "Never underestimate what can be learned from simply paying attention." Maggie smiled, a little emboldened. "I think I will keep doing that. You can see a lot if you keep your eyes open." "Indeed you can," Miss Marple said. And in the girl's earnest expression, she thought she glimpsed the makings of someone who would navigate life a little more wisely than before. The trial, when it came, was just as Inspector Graves had predicted. Each woman sought to shift the heavier blame onto the other. The newspapers delighted in the unusual nature of the crime, with headlines about the double poisoning and murder beneath the apple boughs. Readers were fascinated by the idea of two separate hands unknowingly conspiring toward the same deadly end. Miss Marple did not attend. She saw no need. She had already heard the essential truths in her parlor that afternoon when pride and mistrust had loosened their tongues. The verdicts, guilty for both, were delivered on the third day, the jury needing less than 2 hours of deliberation. Sentence was passed in the solemn tones of the court, and the matter passed formally from the realm of gossip to that of history. In St. Mildred's, life went on. The mill house stood empty, its windows shuttered, awaiting some new occupant brave or indifferent enough to take it on. Mrs. Hartwell's cottage, too, was locked and silent. The absence of both women altered the village's social balance in small, curious ways. Conversations shifted, small alliances reformed, and a few long-standing feuds found themselves suddenly without fuel. Miss Marple found herself once again free to move through her days without being stopped quite so often by eager questioners. The spring sunshine warmed her garden, and the first roses began to bloom. Yet every so often, as she passed the orchard, she would pause and glance toward the apple trees. She thought of the toffee apple with its bright, cracked shell, of a glove slipped from a hand, of a pearl-headed hatpin glinting in the grass. It was not a morbid reflection, more a quiet acknowledgement that such things could and did happen anywhere. Evil, she knew, did not confine itself to dark alleys or city streets. It could stand beside you at a village fair, exchange polite words over seed cake, and smile as it handed you something sweet. One soft golden afternoon, Miss Marple took her knitting to the bench on the green. The air was scented faintly with lilac, and the hum of bees drifted from the churchyard. As she worked, she watched the life of the village moving quietly around her. Children playing near the pond, Mrs. Pottle hurrying toward the vicarage with a covered dish, Alfie Marks wheeling a barrow of tools toward the orchard. It struck her, as it often did, how swiftly the extraordinary became part of the ordinary. The harvest fair of that year would be remembered, yes, but already it was folding itself into the longer story of St. Mildred's, a story of gardens and gossip, quarrels and reconciliations, and the steady passing of the seasons. She set down her knitting for a moment, letting the sun warm her face. The affair of Harold Price was over, concluded as neatly as such things ever were. Yet she knew there would be another case someday, perhaps here, perhaps elsewhere, because people, being what they were, could not help themselves. They would love, they would envy, they would resent, and now and then they would kill. And when they did, she would be there, quiet and unassuming, noticing what others overlooked, piecing together the pattern from the smallest of threads. For that was, in its way, as much a part of the village as the church tower or the market cross. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, the needles clicking softly in the still air. Somewhere in the orchard beyond, a single petal drifted down from a bough, turning lazily before it touched the grass. She watched it fall, and her lips curved in the faintest of smiles. It was 3 days after the verdicts when Inspector Graves called at Miss Marple's cottage one final time. The air outside was crisp with the promise of early spring, the lanes bright with primroses, yet the inspector's expression still bore the seriousness of the weeks just past. "I thought," he began, as she ushered him into the parlor, "you might like to know the whole thing's put to bed. Both women have been taken on to the prison at Holloway. The judge remarked on the unusual nature of the crime, though I think he was being polite. He really meant bewildering." Miss Marple poured the tea and handed him a cup. Two minds working toward the same end without knowing it. Yes, it does rather confound the usual sense of cause and effect. Graves smiled faintly. "And yet, you saw it coming before the rest of us. How did you know they weren't working together?" She stirred her tea gently, her eyes on the swirling liquid. Because they each displayed the same small trait, a tendency to want control. Such people do not share well. The moment I learned Mrs. Hartwell had drawn Caroline's attention to that particular apple, and Caroline had nonetheless chosen it without hesitation, I saw that the real question wasn't who poisoned it, but how both could be so certain of its effect. Graves set his cup down. And your little tea party was the test. Indeed, pride is a most useful instrument. If you give two such people the stage, they will vie to seize the spotlight, even in guilt. By the end, they were more concerned with taking credit for the deed than with concealing it. He chuckled. I'll remember that. Not the sort of tactic they teach at the yard. When he had gone, the cottage settled back into its gentle quiet. Outside, the light slanted across the orchard, picking out the fine lattice of bare branches against the pale sky. Miss Marple sat for a moment, hands folded in her lap, considering the pattern of it all. In the end, the affair had not been a single clean line from motive to act, but two lines converging, an intersection of malice. Mrs. Hartwell with her simmering resentment and desire to humiliate, Caroline Price with her calculation and wish to be rid of a husband who had outlived his usefulness. Each had chosen her moment. Each had believed herself the sole author. Fate, or rather, human vanity, had ensured their plans collided perfectly. It was, she thought, a fitting reminder that crimes were seldom the work of cold logic alone. More often, they were a muddle of passions and petty grievances, of careful planning undermined by the unpredictability of others. And it was in that muddle, in the untidy seams between intention and action, that the truth could be found, if one looked closely enough. She rose and went to the window, her gaze drifting once more to the orchard. Soon the boughs would be heavy with blossom, and the villagers would gather beneath them for the next harvest fair. There would be laughter and chatter, and perhaps another tray of toffee apples, though she suspected Mrs. Felton might stick to plain sponge this year. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, private smile. The peace of St. Mildred's would hold for now, but she knew, as surely as she knew the seasons would turn, that somewhere down the line, the calm would ripple again. And when it did, she would be ready. Not because she sought it, but because she understood, better than most, that human nature was as perennial as the apple trees and just as capable of producing both sweet and bitter fruit.